What happens when history goes quiet? Not simply quiet in the sense of fewer wars or fewer monuments, but truly silent. A long, yawning void in the record. 1,000 years where progress halted, pages vanished, and innovation seemingly disappeared. This is what many know as the Dark Ages. From the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century to the rise of the Renaissance in the 15th lies a span of nearly a millennium. And yet, when that immense stretch of time is examined, something doesn't feel right. A civilization capable of aqueducts, surgical tools, concrete, and philosophy suddenly forgets. The bright minds of antiquity, Hippocrates, Ptolemy, Galen, Archimedes, vanish into obscurity. Literacy collapses, science retreats, architecture devolves. The candle of knowledge, once burning brilliantly in cities like Athens, Rome, and Alexandria, is snuffed out. At least, that's the story we've been told. But why? Why would such a vast and complex world, rich in infrastructure and intellect, slide so thoroughly into ignorance? And why for so long? These are not questions of curiosity. They are questions of contradiction. Historians claim it was the natural result of collapse. Barbarian invasions, civil disorder, loss of central governance. And yet, similar upheaval in other cultures, Persia, China, India, did not produce a millennium-long standstill. They recovered. They evolved. Europe, meanwhile, remained curiously static. One might expect scattered records, inconsistent progress, slow rebuilding. But instead, the timeline of early medieval Europe presents something else entirely. A near total vacuum. Fewer books, fewer inventions, fewer names, fewer events. Consider this. Between the years 500 and 1000 AD, fewer than a dozen widely acknowledged scientific advancements are recorded in Western Europe. Fewer than a dozen, across 500 years. No renowned mathematicians, no notable medical breakthroughs, no astronomers of record, no major texts surviving from that time. Where then did the knowledge go? And why? Has it never fully returned? Some say it was simply lost, burned in fires, forgotten in war, drowned in monasteries and bogs. But if the knowledge had truly been lost, shouldn't there be some trace of the loss itself? Fragments? Partial manuscripts? Conflicting records? Even ruins whisper. But the Dark Ages, in many ways, do not whisper. They disappear. 1,000-year fog of missing documentation, architectural stagnation, and cultural silence. Which leads to a deeper question. What if this silence was not a symptom, but a strategy? What if someone benefited from the forgetting? In every era of history, information is power. To control the narrative is to control the mind, and to erase history is to reframe it. If there existed an institution, powerful, untouchable, and enduring, capable of stewarding knowledge and preserving authority, would that institution not be tempted to remove threats to its dominance? Would it not prefer a version of history, where it alone held the keys to truth? Some researchers believe that's exactly what happened. That the silence of the Dark Ages is not natural, but manufactured. A vacuum created not by chaos, but by calculation. And once that idea is entertained, the questions multiply. Why did monastic scribes become the only copyists of ancient knowledge? Why were Greek and Roman texts replaced by Latin Christian doctrine? Why were certain books condemned as heresy, their authors silenced, their ideas purged? Why do so many ancient discoveries, from concrete to surgical instruments to cartography, only reappear centuries later, as if re-released? Could it be that the Dark Ages weren't a period of decay, but of deliberate pruning? A reset, a curation of memory, a slow, quiet redirection of civilization's narrative arc. And if that is so, then one must ask, who decided what history would remember? Who controlled the ink? When the parchment was blank? The silence of the Dark Ages may not be empty. It may be filled, purposefully, with nothing. And that nothing may speak volumes. If silence can be constructed, who built it? If 1,000 years of progress could be slowed, scattered, or buried, whose hands held the shovel? There are many explanations offered for the gaps and contradictions within early medieval history. Natural disaster, illiteracy, war, a society in retreat from the collapse of empire. But these explanations come with a pattern. They place blame on no one in particular. They describe a process that is accidental, chaotic, and leaderless. And yet, the outcomes are precise. Certain knowledge vanishes. Certain texts are preserved. Certain languages become sacred. Certain narratives become law. Could such selectivity truly emerge from random decay? Or is there a guiding hand? One institution above all others had the means, the motive, and the longevity to shape how history would be remembered. The Roman Catholic Church. At the height of its medieval power, the Church was more than a religious order. It was a government, a publisher, a judicial system, a monopoly on truth. While kingdoms rose and fell, while emperors died and borders shifted, the Church remained. Stable, centralized, unquestioned. And what is most remarkable is that during the very centuries history has labeled dark, the Church's power only grew brighter. So one must ask, what if the Dark Ages were not a time of absence, but a time of consolidation? What if the void was created not by accident, but by intention? To eliminate competition? To erase rival histories? To become the sole interpreter of reality? This is the core of the hypothesis, that the timeline known as the Dark Ages was not a passive lull in human development, but a curated silence. A silence designed, maintained, and protected by the Church to serve its own long-term vision. For centuries, the Church controlled not only the spiritual lives of Europe's population, but also their intellectual ones. It dictated which books could be copied, which stories were allowed to be told, which languages could be understood, which ideas were to be remembered, and which were to be forgotten. This power was not exercised with violence alone, though there was violence. It was exercised through exclusivity, through ritual, through architecture, through literacy. In a world where only priests could read, the written word became divine. Scripture became law, and questioning that law became sin. As the ancient world faded, a new world emerged, one filtered through the lens of church doctrine. The stories of the past were rewritten. Pagans became villains, martyrs became heroes, emperors became servants of God. But buried beneath the new narrative were fragments of the old, fragments the Church could not entirely destroy. Whispers of ancient knowledge, echoes of rival philosophies, scraps of manuscripts too widespread to burn. These remnants would one day re-emerge during the Renaissance, an era named for rebirth, but in truth, a controlled resurrection of what had once been buried. So what, then, was the purpose of erasing the past? Power. If knowledge is fragmented, if time is misaligned, if people forget what came before, then they can be told who they are, where they came from, what to believe. This is the terrifying simplicity of the theory, that the greatest lie ever told was not a single event, but an entire epoch. And it was not hidden in shadows. It was hidden in plain sight, inside stone cathedrals, between pages of scripture, in the silence of centuries that no one dared to question. But what if someone did question it? What if the dates are wrong? What if the records were altered? What if the so-called Dark Ages never actually happened? In the sessions ahead, the theory will deepen. Evidence will emerge, fragmented, strange, and often unsettling. Timelines will bend. Heroes will fade, maps will mislead, and even time itself will become suspect. But the journey begins here, with a question not of history, but of motive. If one institution held the means to shape history, if it had the motive to erase opposition, and if it stood to benefit from a rewritten past, then the next question is simple. What exactly did it do, and how far was it willing to go? If a story is to be rewritten, the original must first be destroyed. History is not only written by the victors, it is also preserved by the libraries. And for most of the ancient world, knowledge lived in parchment, in clay, in scrolls carefully copied by hand and stored in sanctuaries of learning. Libraries were not buildings. They were civilizations in miniature, repositories of medicine, astronomy, philosophy, law, and poetry. And among them, one stood above all others, the Library of Alexandria. Founded in Egypt during the reign of the Ptolemaic dynasty, this library was said to have held hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Some accounts speak of over 700,000 volumes drawn from Greece, Persia, India, and even early China. It was a beacon of open knowledge, a place where differing ideas could coexist, be debated, translated, preserved. And then it burned. Multiple times. The first blaze came, allegedly, at the hands of Julius Caesar. The second, perhaps during the conflict with Emperor Aurelian. Later, under Christian rule, the Temple of Serapis, the daughter library of Alexandria, was razed. Finally, by the 7th century during the Muslim conquest, it was claimed the remaining texts were destroyed for violating the Quran. But here lies the problem. No one knows exactly when the library fell, or who was responsible, or why precisely it was targeted so many times. What is known is that it ceased to exist. And with its disappearance, the memory of entire civilizations faded. Medical treatises, mathematical formulas, philosophical dialogues, star charts, maps, laws, poetry, gone. Why was such a site not protected? Why were its scrolls not dispersed, copied, hidden? Why was no effort made by the Church, rising in influence at the time, to preserve this cradle of knowledge? Or perhaps the better question is, was the silence intentional? The destruction of Alexandria is not an isolated case. The library at Pergamon, once a rival to Alexandria, was looted and stripped. The libraries of Antioch and Constantinople, pillaged and burned repeatedly. Even the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a later center of Islamic science, would eventually fall to flames. A pattern begins to emerge. Wherever diverse knowledge accumulated, destruction soon followed. And in its place, silence. During these same centuries, a new structure of knowledge was rising. Monasteries, scriptoria, the sacred rooms where monks copied texts, slowly by candlelight, one line at a time. But not every text, only those that were approved, sanctioned, safe. Pagan philosophers were redacted, if not outright erased. Medical texts were abandoned for scripture. Science was folded into theology. And history, real, messy, complicated history, was replaced by hagiography. Saints, martyrs, miracles, but no architects, no engineers, no astronomers. A knowledge vacuum had been created, and into that vacuum stepped a new gatekeeper, the Church. It did not need to burn every scroll. It only needed to decide which scrolls would survive. By the early Middle Ages, most of what had once defined classical learning was inaccessible to the average person. Not because it was gone, but because it was locked away, translated into Latin, hidden in monasteries, reserved for clergy, and over time, forgotten. But every erasure leaves a scar. Some fragments remained. Arabic translations of Greek texts preserved in the Islamic Golden Age. Jewish scholars safeguarding knowledge in exile. And later, Renaissance humanists stumbling upon dusty volumes in monastic archives as if discovering treasure buried by time. But was it buried by time or by design? What civilization lets its greatest minds fade from memory without protest? What culture forgets how to make its own cement, its own maps, its own tools? Unless someone decided it was better that way. Unless someone believed that the past itself was dangerous, and if knowledge is dangerous, then ignorance becomes power. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Europe was no longer the inheritor of Greek and Roman brilliance. It had become a continent of controlled knowledge, fed only what its gatekeepers allowed. The libraries had not just burned, they had been replaced, and the world would not realize what had been lost, until centuries later, when a few forgotten books began to resurface. But by then, the timeline had already been altered, the story already rewritten, and the truth scattered in ashes. When a fire consumes a library, the loss is instant. But when knowledge is altered, one word at a time, the loss is slower, quieter, harder to detect. After the collapse of the ancient centers of learning, Alexandria, Pergamon, Antioch, one question looms large. What happened to the manuscripts that did survive? The answer lies not in emperors or philosophers, but in ink-stained monks bent over wooden desks hidden deep within the walls of monasteries. As chaos engulfed the Western world, one institution offered stability: the Church. Its abbeys, cathedrals, and scriptoria became not only sanctuaries of worship, but also of transcription. But not all texts were welcome. By the 6th century, the Church had assumed near total control over the act of copying, the process by which knowledge was preserved from one generation to the next. Scrolls from the classical world, scientific, mathematical, medical, philosophical, were reviewed, selected, and in many cases, modified before being recopied. This was not simply preservation, it was filtration. It is known that scribes often added marginalia, notes, corrections, theological commentary. But some went further. Passages from pagan authors were reworded to align with Christian doctrine. Entire sections were omitted. Other works were simply left to rot, deemed unworthy of copying. In this way, the written record of Western civilization was narrowed, not by destruction, but by omission. A single generation of monks could decide what ideas would survive for the next 1,000 years. And once an idea was lost, who would even remember it had existed? This raises a haunting truth. What humanity remembers is determined by what humanity chooses to copy. And for centuries, the Church alone chose. Consider the fate of Lucretius, the Roman poet who wrote De Rerum Natura, on the nature of things. His work described atoms, evolution, and a universe governed by natural law, not gods. The Church considered his philosophy dangerously heretical. And so, it vanished. For over 1,000 years, no one read Lucretius, until a single copy resurfaced in a German monastery in 1417, covered in dust, almost lost forever. How many other manuscripts never resurfaced? How many ideas were quietly erased, not with flame, but with silence? Modern scholars have documented intentional Christian redactions in texts by Aristotle, Galen, and even Plato. Lines were removed, meanings altered, interpretations adjusted to reflect divine providence. But perhaps the more important question is not what was changed, but why? At the heart of this process was a simple idea: that truth must be compatible with doctrine. And anything that challenged the faith, cosmology, medicine, metaphysics, was either rewritten to fit or purged. This was the age of doctrinal purification. The goal was not to preserve knowledge. The goal was to control it. Even the word heresy, from the Greek heresis, meaning choice, was redefined. Once a neutral term, it became a threat. To choose a different truth was now a crime against God. And so choice itself was removed. Scribes became editors. Editors became censors. And censorship became holy. This monopoly extended beyond the monasteries. Church councils began to issue lists of forbidden books, the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. Books not just discouraged, but banned. Possession of certain texts became grounds for punishment, even death. In some cases, merely questioning the canonical version of history was treated as dissent. The consequences were not theoretical. They were written in blood. Giordano Bruno, burned for his ideas about the cosmos, but also for his possession of forbidden manuscripts. William of Ockham, excommunicated for proposing that theology and logic must remain separate. Entire generations of thinkers were silenced before their ideas could take root. And yet, the Church maintained that it was acting as a steward of truth, a divine librarian protecting humanity from error. But error in this context meant deviation from doctrine. Was this truly stewardship, or was it strategic narrative control? To determine which voices get to speak across centuries is to shape civilization itself. And by monopolizing the act of copying, the Church had gained a quiet, enduring power. Control the scribes, and you control the story. Control the story, and you control memory. Control memory, and you control reality. It is no longer necessary to burn the books, if you simply decide which ones are never written again. This is how history can be rewritten, without a single lie ever needing to be told. Only omissions. Only silence. Only the slow, holy scratch of quills echoing in candlelit halls. Copying not just words, but a new version of the world. A locked door needs no guards, if no one knows how to open it. And in the Middle Ages, that door was not made of iron or stone. It was made of language. As Europe slipped deeper into the centuries now called the Dark Ages, the language of the people fractured. The Latin of the Romans splintered into tongues we now call French, Spanish, Italian, and Portuguese. The Germanic dialects grew stronger in the north. Slavic languages spread through the east. But one form of speech did not evolve. One language remained frozen, untouched, unyielding, ecclesiastical Latin. The Church preserved this language, its syntax, its grammar, its pronunciation, not as a tool for communication, but as a veil, because in time, Latin ceased to be a living tongue. It was no longer spoken in markets, not sung by mothers, not whispered in taverns. It was spoken only in pulpits, recited only in rituals, read only in manuscripts hidden behind monastery walls. And so, it became something else. It became sacred. But sacred does not mean accessible. For the average medieval peasant, laboring in the fields, unlettered, impoverished, the words of the Bible were inaudible. He could hear them spoken in church. He could see them written on faded parchment, but he could not understand them. And that, perhaps, was the point. The Holy Scriptures were locked behind a language barrier, a divine code, readable only by the priests who claimed to be its rightful interpreters. If one could not read Latin, one could not question the doctrine. If one could not speak Latin, one could not debate the canon. If one could not translate Latin, one could not reclaim the truth. And so, truth itself became the property of the educated class. A class groomed by the Church, trained in its seminaries, bound by its vows. It is no coincidence that the same institution that declared Latin to be sacred was also the only institution allowed to teach it. Through this system, knowledge was transformed into privilege, not earned by merit, but granted through obedience. The faithful were not meant to study theology. They were meant to accept it. The Church claimed to speak on their behalf, to interpret the Word of God, to explain the meaning of history, to tell them who they were. But what happens when one cannot read the words of their own salvation? What happens when a man's entire worldview is handed to him, translated, filtered, interpreted by a priest, with no way to verify it for himself? It creates a dependency, a spiritual dependency, an intellectual dependency, a civilization that cannot think outside the boundaries of the words it cannot access. The monopoly over Latin ensured that knowledge would no longer be shared, but dispensed, like water from a holy fountain, measured out, controlled, and guarded. And yet, Latin itself is not inherently evil. It is precise, beautiful, logical. But in the wrong hands, even beauty can be weaponized. What began as a language of empire became a language of gatekeeping. It allowed the Church to maintain continuity of control, even as empires fell and kings changed. Every official document, every liturgical text, every scientific treatise, written not for the people, but for the institution. And so, Latin functioned as a filter, a linguistic curtain separating the clergy from the laity, the scholar from the subject, the sacred from the profane. Those behind the curtain had access to the full script. Those in front of it were left in the dark. There were, of course, moments of rebellion. In the 14th century, John Wycliffe dared to translate the Bible into English. He was posthumously condemned, his bones exhumed and burned, his work declared heresy. In the 16th century, William Tyndale did the same. He was strangled and set on fire, his only crime, making sacred words understandable. But why such fear? Why such violence against a translation? Unless... The fear was never about the language itself, but about what might be discovered once the people could read for themselves. What might they notice? What might they question? What inconsistencies, what contradictions, what omissions would rise to the surface? Because language is not merely a medium. It is a container. And if one controls the container, one controls what can exist within it. The use of Latin in the Middle Ages was not only a liturgical choice, it was a strategy, a soft wall, a hushed censorship, a world where books could be displayed, but not decoded, where truths could be whispered, but not understood, where knowledge could be everywhere, and still belong to no one. Every society teaches its children, but not every society teaches them to think. Some teach them to remember, to recite, to obey. In the medieval world, education was a privilege reserved for the few, and a tool wielded by the powerful. While peasants worked the fields and merchants bartered in muddy streets, a small number of boys were chosen, selected not for brilliance, but for their obedience. They were taken into cathedral schools, monastic academies, and later the first universities. Places where the lessons were not of freedom, but of submission. The Church controlled nearly every formal center of learning from the 6th to the 14th century, and it designed the curriculum not to liberate minds, but to bind them. The very word education comes from the Latin educare, to lead out. But in this context, it might better be described as leading inward into a system from which no alternative thought was allowed to escape. Students were taught to read, but only scripture. They learned to write, but only in Latin. They studied logic, but only as it applied to theology. This was not education in the modern sense. This was indoctrination. Lessons began with rote memorization. The Psalms, the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed. Recite, repeat, do not question. Philosophical reasoning, when taught at all, was allowed only to the extent that it supported church doctrine. The writings of Aristotle, once banned for their pagan origins, were later embraced, but only when reframed to fit Christian theology, filtered through thinkers like Thomas Aquinas. The message was clear. You may question within the lines, but you may never draw outside them. This control extended beyond content. It shaped habits of thought. The medieval education system trained young minds to associate knowledge with hierarchy. Truth flowed downward, not upward. From God to Pope, from Pope to Bishop, from Bishop to Priest, from Priest to Pupil. There was no room for bottom-up discovery. No method for independent inquiry. No mechanism for challenging authority. To question a teacher was to question the Church. To question the Church was to question God. This structure created what some scholars call vertical thinking. Not exploratory, not expansive, but deferential. It rewarded conformity. It punished doubt, and over time, it produced a society in which most people never learned how to ask questions. Only how to accept answers. Compare this to the classical world, where Socrates taught by questioning, where the dialectic was central to learning, where the student was a seeker, not a servant. That world was gone. In its place stood the medieval classroom, a cold stone room, a boy on a bench, a master with a rod, a book in Latin, a lesson not in how to think, but what to think. Even the physical design of these schools reinforced hierarchy. No round tables, No open forums, only rows of silent students, facing forward, facing upward. What did this produce? A generation of scholars who knew how to cite Augustine, but not how to test a hypothesis. A priesthood fluent in doctrine, but illiterate in anatomy, astronomy, or natural law. A culture in which deviation from accepted belief was not error. It was sin. The consequences were profound. Medicine stagnated, astronomy regressed, geography collapsed into myth. Entire fields of knowledge stood still, because the minds meant to advance them had been taught not to reach. And this stagnation was not the result of ignorance, but of obedience. In time, even universities, the supposed centers of higher thought, became echo chambers of theological repetition. The University of Paris, Oxford, Bologna. All were built under church oversight. All taught theology as the queen of the sciences. All used Latin as the sole language of instruction. And in every classroom, the message was the same: believe first, understand later, or not at all. This was not accidental. This was not a flaw in the system. This was the system. An education designed to produce not thinkers, but believers. Not rebels, but repeaters. Not seekers, but servants. And when a child is taught from an early age to associate knowledge with fear, to see questions as dangerous, to view obedience as virtue, then that child becomes an adult incapable of resisting the story he is told. The story of history, the story of power, the story of time. But stories can be rewritten, and when no one dares to question them, they become reality. What if the most sacred book in the world wasn't whole? What if it had once contained other voices, other gospels, other accounts, other truths? And those voices were silenced. The Bible, as known today, is regarded by billions as the Word of God, a divine document, eternal, complete. But it was not always one book, nor was it always one story. In the early centuries of Christianity, dozens of texts circulated among believers. Some told the life of Jesus. Others described his teachings in radically different ways. Some emphasized personal enlightenment. Others questioned church authority altogether. These were the lost books: the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Judas, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Apocalypse of Peter. Many were written by those who claimed to have known Christ personally, and yet they were excluded. Why? To understand the answer, one must understand the process. The Bible did not fall from the sky in its current form. It was assembled, piece by piece, scroll by scroll, through a long and deeply political process. By the 4th century AD, the Roman Empire had embraced Christianity. But an empire requires order, and a religion with dozens of competing scriptures is unstable. So the church convened. Councils were held: Nicaea, Hippo, Carthage. Committees of bishops and scholars debated not just theology, but which texts would survive. In time, a canon was established. Certain gospels were declared authoritative. Others were banned. The rejected books were labeled apocrypha, hidden, or worse, heretical. But what made them heretical? Many of the forbidden texts present a very different view of Christ, not as a savior dying for mankind's sins, but as a teacher revealing hidden wisdom, not as a divine intermediary, but as a figure urging self-knowledge. Some of these books portray women as apostles. Others describe spiritual realms incompatible with church dogma. Still others contain prophecies the hierarchy could not explain, or dared not allow to spread. Take, for example, the Gospel of Thomas. It contains 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. There are no miracles, no resurrection, just cryptic, philosophical teachings. It states, "The kingdom is inside you, and it is outside you. When you know yourselves, you will understand that you are the sons of the living Father." Such a message bypasses the need for priests, rituals, or institutions. It suggests the divine is not mediated by the church, but discovered within. That idea was intolerable, because if salvation is internal, then what becomes of the hierarchy? The suppression of these texts was not merely theological, it was strategic. By narrowing the canon, the church simplified the story. It controlled the doctrine. It eliminated ambiguity. One story, one savior, one church. And yet, the excluded texts did not vanish entirely. Fragments survived, buried in jars, hidden in caves, passed quietly through generations. In 1945, in a desert cave near Nag Hammadi, Egypt, a sealed jar was discovered. Inside, over a dozen ancient codices, perfectly preserved. Among them, the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, and the Apocalypse of Adam. It was as if a door had reopened. But instead of celebration, there was fear. The Vatican did not openly denounce the discovery, but it discouraged discussion. Scholars were warned. Translations delayed. Why? What danger could a lost gospel pose? To a religion centuries old? Unless. The danger was never historical. It was ideological. Because if these texts are authentic, if they represent real, early Christian voices, then the Bible as we know it is not complete. It is curated. It is the product of a process driven by politics, power, and control. And that realization destabilizes more than doctrine. It challenges the entire historical timeline of the church. What else was omitted? What other voices were silenced? What truths, what facts were locked away not in caves, but in vaults? There are whispers of entire books still hidden in the Vatican secret archives, texts never released, gospels never translated, writings never seen. If even one of them contradicts the canonical version, then the foundation of medieval Christianity begins to crack. And when the foundation cracks, the structure becomes exposed. What we call heresy may not have been rebellion, but resistance. What we call orthodoxy may not have been truth, but victory. And what we call history may have been edited. What if the lie was not in the words of history, but in the length of it? What if entire centuries never happened? In the grand chronicle of human civilization, there are timelines we take for granted. We are told that the year is what it is, that 2025 follows 2024, that the 10th century came after the 9th. But the calendar is not a natural force. It is not embedded in the sky or carved into the earth. It is a construct, built, adjusted, maintained, and as with any construction, it can be manipulated. In the 1990s, a German historian named Heribert Illig proposed a theory, one that would send tremors through the academic world. A theory that sounds at first like madness, but demands attention because of what it implies. It is called the phantom time hypothesis. and it claims that somewhere between the years 614 and 911 AD, roughly 297 years of history were artificially inserted into the timeline. Inserted, not lived, not recorded, not experienced, invented. According to the theory, the calendar we now use, known as the Gregorian calendar, doesn't actually match real astronomical time. Instead, it includes 3 centuries that were fabricated, likely sometime during the early medieval period. If true, this would mean that everything we think we know about the early Middle Ages, Charlemagne, the Carolingian Renaissance, the foundations of the Holy Roman Empire, may be, in large part, fictional. But how is that possible? Who would do such a thing? And why? According to Illig and others, the deception may have begun with Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII, powerful rulers with a shared motive: to legitimize their power, to situate themselves in a grander historical narrative, and most crucially, to place the year of their reign close to the symbolic year 1000 AD. In a medieval world obsessed with apocalypse and prophecy, the year 1000 held immense religious weight. To rule at that threshold was to appear ordained, a ruler of destiny, a figure not of history, but of eternity. But there was a problem. The real date, Illig suggests, was closer to the 7th century, not the 10th. So the solution was simple. Adjust the record, invent the gap, backfill the centuries. And once invented, those centuries had to be populated. Figures like Charlemagne, a towering emperor credited with restoring Western civilization, appear precisely at the heart of this phantom time. But Charlemagne's biography is riddled with contradictions, inconsistent dates, suspiciously perfect victories, an empire that vanished just decades after it was supposedly built. Did Charlemagne truly exist, or was he a composite? A myth stitched together from older Roman emperors, repurposed kings, and biblical archetypes. Supporters of the phantom time hypothesis argue that much of early medieval history is strangely repetitive, that names, titles, and events appear to echo older Roman or biblical precedents, that art, architecture, and technology during this period are oddly stagnant, almost unchanged for 300 years. And that's only the beginning. As the theory spread, researchers began to ask uncomfortable questions. Why are the archaeological layers from 7th to 10th century Europe so sparse? Why are written documents from this period so remarkably few compared to both earlier Roman records and later medieval manuscripts? Why do so many innovations, cities, and monarchies seem to restart around the 10th century? Could it be that civilization didn't sleep for 300 years, but rather that those years never existed? The implications are staggering. If time itself was manipulated, then every date, every historical figure, every assumed sequence of events must be re-examined. Not because someone misplaced a century, but because someone manufactured it. Of course, the theory has its critics. Mainstream historians argue that the phantom time hypothesis ignores too much evidence. That calendar drift, astronomical records, and regional histories contradict Illig's claims that the Gregorian reform was a correction, not a conspiracy. And yet, the questions remain. The Julian calendar, which preceded the Gregorian one, was off by roughly 11 minutes per year. Over centuries, this drift should have caused serious misalignment, particularly in liturgical events like Easter. And yet, when Pope Gregory X reformed the calendar in 1582, only 10 days were removed. Not 13, not 14, but 10. If the calendar had been in use for as long as claimed, shouldn't the drift have been far greater? Unless the timeline had already been shortened. What if the Church wasn't just correcting time, but concealing that it had already been corrected once before? What if the Gregorian reform wasn't a fix, but a second layer of paint over an already doctored canvas? And if this theory holds even a grain of truth, then the Church didn't just rewrite Scripture, it rewrote reality. Time became theology, chronology became belief, and history became narrative. In the sessions that follow, this theory will deepen. We will examine the astronomical inconsistencies, the fabricated emperors, the missing eclipses, and the vanishing cities. All signs that point toward something once unthinkable, that the Dark Ages may not have been dark, but hollow, a space in history where nothing happened, because nothing was ever meant to. The stars do not lie. They burn without memory. They turn without politics. They move, year after year, in patterns so precise they can be calculated centuries in advance, and centuries in reverse. Unlike kingdoms, calendars, or chronicles, the heavens cannot be forged. And that is precisely where the cracks begin to show. If the phantom time hypothesis is true, if nearly 3 centuries of history were fabricated, then the stars themselves should not align with our written records, and according to some researchers, they don't. Let us begin with the calendar. The Julian calendar, introduced by Julius Caesar in 45 BC, assumed a year was exactly 365 days long. But in truth, the solar year is slightly shorter, approximately 365 days, a difference of just 11 minutes per year. But over centuries, even minutes matter. By the time of Pope Gregory XIII in the late 16th century, this discrepancy had accumulated into roughly 10 days of calendar drift. To realign Easter with the spring equinox, the Gregorian calendar was introduced in 1582, and 10 days were removed from the calendar. But here lies the problem. If the Julian calendar had been in continuous use for over 1,600 years, then the accumulated drift should have been closer to 13 days, not 10. So why were only 10 removed? Is it possible that someone had already adjusted the calendar centuries earlier? Unrecorded, undocumented, and that those missing centuries never needed correction in the first place? This is where astronomy becomes the test. Throughout history, civilizations have recorded eclipses, solar and lunar events that can be traced precisely using modern software. Each eclipse is like a fingerprint in time, uniquely dated, observable across specific regions. And yet, when scholars examine eclipse records from the so-called Dark Ages, roughly 600 to 900 AD, they find mismatches. Descriptions of solar eclipses occurring on dates that do not align with known astronomical models. Eclipses said to have appeared over certain regions, when in fact no such shadow would have passed there. Or worse, no records at all, where eclipses should have been visible. Is this a sloppy documentation? A lack of observers? Or evidence that the events being described were never observed at all? Because they never happened? Or perhaps more disturbingly, because there were no observers, because the time period had not yet been invented. Let us consider an example. An eclipse dated to May 1st, 664 AD, reported in multiple Anglo-Saxon chronicles, does not appear in astronomical reconstructions. Modern models suggest that no significant eclipse was visible in the British Isles on that date. Yet the chronicle insists. The The sun darkened. The sky grew dim. People were afraid. How does one explain this? Mistaken identity? A different atmospheric phenomenon? Or a record created later to fill in a timeline that had been retroactively assembled? These inconsistencies repeat throughout early medieval sources. Eclipses, planetary alignments, and celestial events do not match their expected positions, unless the historical timeline is compressed. But astronomy is not the only anomaly. Architecture, too, seems oddly out of sync. Buildings from the so-called 10th century bear striking resemblance to structures from the 7th. Technological progression appears stagnant, unchanged, uninspired, uninterrupted. Art styles repeat. Coinage designs remain static. It's as if time itself forgot to evolve. And still, defenders of orthodoxy insist there must be another explanation. Perhaps the scribes misdated the eclipses. Perhaps the architects reused old designs. Perhaps the coins reflect a cultural conservatism. But how many perhaps does it take before one must reconsider the foundation? And what of astronomical backdating? Illig and other proponents argue that some eclipse records may have been inserted later, using calculations rather than observation. In other words, that medieval scribes, or their sponsors, back-calculated events that should have occurred and wrote them into history to give the illusion of an unbroken chronology. A clever deception, but not a perfect one, because real observations contain detail. Atmospheric effects, regional variations, human reactions, fabricated ones. Do not. They are mathematical, dry, convenient, like puzzle pieces that fit too perfectly. And so the stars become witnesses, silent, impartial, eternal. And when they are called to testify against the calendar, the story that emerges is chilling. That the sky itself does not match the script we have been given. That the dates are off, the records mismatched, the flow of time tampered. And if the stars, our most trustworthy historians, are out of sync with the chronicles, then the question becomes unavoidable. Who synchronized the lie? Who adjusted the calendar to fit a version of history that had already been edited? Who told us we lived in the 10th century, when perhaps we were still in the 7th? And if 3 centuries could be added to the record, how many more could be hidden beneath it? Some names in history are too large to question. They tower over textbooks. They define eras. They symbolize rebirth, greatness, empire. And yet, sometimes the biggest names cast the longest shadows. Few figures in medieval history are more celebrated than Charlemagne, the great Frankish king, the first Holy Roman Emperor, the so-called Father of Europe. He is credited with uniting Western Europe, reviving classical learning, and laying the foundations for modern Christendom. But what if the legacy of Charlemagne, his conquests, his laws, even his very existence, was a carefully constructed story? What if Charlemagne, as history knows him, was invented? This is the unsettling possibility at the heart of the phantom time hypothesis. That the emperor who anchors the early medieval period, who sits at the center of the phantom centuries, may not be who he appears to be. Let us begin with the official story. Charlemagne was born in 742 AD and crowned emperor in 800 AD by Pope Leo III. His empire stretched across modern-day France, Germany, Italy, and beyond. He led dozens of military campaigns, instituted sweeping reforms, and ushered in what historians call the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of art, culture, and education. It is a grand narrative. too grand, perhaps. Because when this story is examined not for its content, but for its consistency, cracks begin to appear. First, the sources. Nearly everything known about Charlemagne comes from a single biography. The Vita Caroli Magni, Life of Charles the Great, written by Einhard, a courtier and monk. But this biography was composed decades after Charlemagne's death, and Einhard himself admits that much of it is drawn from oral accounts. In other words, the foundational text for Charlemagne's life is a second-hand eulogy, not a contemporaneous chronicle. Furthermore, no contemporary statues, portraits, or coins bearing a confirmed likeness of Charlemagne exist. There is no firm archaeological evidence, no tomb, no body, no die. What survives are later depictions, often idealized, often anachronistic. And what about the Carolingian Renaissance? It is said that Charlemagne revived classical learning by gathering scholars from across Europe. But the Renaissance left surprisingly few physical traces. Where are the great libraries, the innovations, the architecture? Much of what is attributed to this cultural revival appears, suspiciously, similar to what came before or what came later, as if it had been inserted to give shape to a historical void. More tellingly, the empire Charlemagne supposedly built, vast, centralized, powerful, collapsed almost immediately after his death. His grandsons divided it. His reforms unraveled. Within a few generations, his name faded, only to re-emerge in later centuries as a symbol, more than a memory. Is this the natural decay of empire, or the failure of a fictional timeline to sustain itself? There are also startling parallels between Charlemagne and earlier figures. His coronation on Christmas Day mirrors that of Roman emperors. His legal reforms echo earlier Byzantine codes. Even his name, Carolus Magnus, bears uncanny resemblance to Constantine the Great. Too uncanny, perhaps. Scholars have noted that some elements of Charlemagne's story appear composite, as if he were a fusion of several historical models blended into one idealized king. Was he modeled on Constantine, on David, on Augustus? Or was he constructed to be the missing link? A symbolic ruler to justify the transition from Rome to the Holy Roman Empire. And who stood to benefit? Charlemagne's reign, according to official chronology, ended shortly before the year 900. Exactly the period identified by phantom time theorists as fabricated. If one were to insert 3 centuries of history, one would need to fill them with events. With wars, with laws, with rulers, and with a figure so grand, so indisputable, that no one would question the timeline he anchors. Charlemagne fits that role perfectly. He is not just a king, he is a pivot point. He connects the fall of Rome to the rise of Europe. He gives the church historical legitimacy. He transforms the Pope into a kingmaker, and he allows the invention of a new era without suspicion. But what if that was the intention all along? What if Charlemagne's biography was not a record, but a script? What if his empire was not remembered, but imagined? And what if his greatness lies not in what he did, but in what he allowed others to claim? This does not mean Charlemagne never existed, but it may mean that the man was far smaller than the myth, that his deeds were exaggerated, duplicated, or entirely transplanted, that Charlemagne is a narrative device more than a historical certainty. And if the central figure of the early Middle Ages is in doubt, then so is everything built around him. His enemies, his reforms, his lineage, his wars, his world. It would mean the history of Europe, at its most fragile moment, was stabilized not by memory, but by invention. and the silence of the Dark Ages was filled with story. The strength of any institution lies not only in what it builds, but in the story it tells about how long it has stood. And few institutions in history have claimed a longer, more sacred continuity than the papacy. From St. Peter, hand-chosen by Christ, according to tradition, to the reigning pope in Rome today, the Church presents an unbroken chain, a lineage stretching across 2 millennia, a divine thread woven through wars, plagues, schisms, and empires. But what if part of that chain was forged? If time itself was manipulated? If centuries were added, kings invented, and history retrofitted? Then surely the Church could not allow gaps in its own timeline. It would need to populate those phantom years, not just with events, but with popes. And so the question arises, is the list of papal succession as continuous as it appears? Let us examine the Liber Pontificalis, the Book of the Popes. This is the Church's own record of papal history, begun in the 6th century, and updated periodically thereafter. Early entries are rich with detail. Dates, events, doctrinal decisions, burials. But during the very period the phantom time hypothesis targets, from approximately 600 to 900 AD, the record becomes strange. Some entries are suspiciously brief, others are missing entirely. Several popes are listed with names, but no deeds, no letters, no teachings, no controversies, just names, dates, a placeholder in a holy sequence. And then, suddenly, detail returns. With the rise of the Ottonian emperors, the papal biographies grow longer again. The narrative resumes, as if the camera, once pointed elsewhere, had been turned back on. Critics of the Liber Pontificalis have noted inconsistencies for decades. Gaps in chronology, overlapping reigns, popes who allegedly reigned during chaos, but left behind no record of reaction. Others who ruled for years, yet were mentioned only in passing. Could it be that some of these popes were invented retroactively? Constructed to fill the vacuum created by phantom time? After all, an institution that claims apostolic succession, direct descent from St. Peter, must maintain a complete chain. Even a single break would shatter the illusion of divine continuity. And for the Vatican, continuity is not just tradition, it is legitimacy. But let us look closer at the pattern. Between Pontian, 230 AD, and Leo IV, 847 AD, the Church claims over 50 popes reigned. And yet, for vast stretches of that period, particularly during the 7th and 8th centuries, there are few surviving documents, few councils, few theological debates, few traces. If the Church was growing, guiding, and governing the faithful through those centuries, why does it leave behind so little? Some have argued that the Dark Ages simply produced fewer writings, that wars, invasions, and illiteracy explain the gaps. But what if the gaps are not the result of decay, but of design? If a false historical timeline was introduced, then its most important institutions had to be retrofitted accordingly. Just as emperors were inserted, just as battles were backfilled, so too the Church would need to produce a sacred lineage that never truly existed. And this raises a deeper question. If popes can be invented, so too can their teachings. So too can their decrees, their letters, their councils. So too can their authority. And once that illusion is established, every subsequent pope inherits the legitimacy of his predecessors, whether they were real or not. Consider also the strange phenomenon of Pope Joan. According to medieval legend, a woman disguised as a man once rose through the church ranks and became pope. She reigned for several years before her identity was discovered. The church has long dismissed this as myth, but the tale persisted for centuries, and some scholars believe it originated as a smokescreen to explain inconsistencies in the succession without admitting forgery. Could Pope Joan have been a symbolic insertion, or a veiled reference to a non-existent pope retroactively explained away? Or could she, too, have been a narrative adjustment? A distraction from deeper alterations? We may never know, because while royal genealogies can be tested through DNA, and historical battles cross-referenced with archaeology, the papal succession is guarded by something more impenetrable: faith. And behind that faith stands the Vatican secret archives, one of the most extensive, most restricted document collections in the world, containing centuries of unopened correspondence, unpublished histories, and unexamined records. Could the truth about fabricated popes lie hidden there? Could the missing evidence be locked away, not lost, but deliberately protected? If so, it would mean that what billions take as a divine inheritance may be in part a carefully layered illusion. Not all lies are told aloud. Some are written on lists, repeated until they are no longer questioned, copied into prayer books, chanted through liturgy, accepted as truth. But truth built on a false timeline is still false. And so the final link in the phantom time chain is forged not by kings, but by pontiffs. And if even the papacy has been shaped by phantom time, then the story of the Dark Ages is no longer about ignorance, it is about construction. Some lies are buried in books, others are etched in ink. And sometimes the map does not match the territory. Not because the land is wrong, but because the map is too accurate. In 1929, a strange object was discovered in the imperial palace of Topkapi in Istanbul. It was a map, tattered, drawn on gazelle skin, covered in delicate red and green inks. It bore the signature of Piri Reis, an Ottoman admiral and cartographer. The date was clear, 1513. But what was depicted on this map should have been impossible. The Piri Reis map shows the western coast of Africa. It shows the eastern coast of South America. And then it shows something else. A coastline, jagged, curving, snowless. An outline that resembles in haunting detail the northern shore of Antarctica. Hundreds of years before its official discovery, centuries before its coastline was ever mapped. And most disturbing of all, the landmass is shown without ice. Antarctica has been buried beneath ice for over 6,000 years. Its true coastline is invisible to the naked eye, only revealed in the 20th century by satellite and seismic surveys. So how did an Ottoman admiral in the early 1500s draw a map that appears to show what lies beneath the ice? The official explanation is cautious. Scholars propose that Piri Reis was compiling older maps, perhaps Greek or Phoenician, long lost to time. Indeed, in his own notes, Piri claims that his work was based on 20 charts and mappae mundi, including sources from Alexander the Great's era. But none of those original maps survive, and none are known to have contained such precise coastal outlines. So where did the data come from? The map's projection has also drawn scrutiny. It appears to use a form of spherical trigonometry consistent with modern understanding of globe-based navigation. And yet, the 16th century world was still grappling with flat Earth debates. Most maps of the time were wildly distorted. This one is not. Its accuracy suggests access to surveying techniques or geodesic knowledge far beyond what was known in 1513, let alone in ancient times. If this was copied from a much older source, then who created that original? And more importantly, when? Some researchers, including Charles Hapgood in the mid-20th century, proposed that the Piri Reis map may be evidence of a lost civilization, one with advanced navigational knowledge now erased from official history. Hapgood's ideas were supported, cautiously, by none other than Albert Einstein, who acknowledged the mystery and encouraged further study. But mainstream academia dismissed the theory. Too speculative, too disruptive. The official consensus remains: coincidence, overinterpretation, an anomaly. And yet, the Piri Reis map is not alone. Other ancient maps, like the Oronce-Finet map of 1531 and the Mercator map of 1569, also depict polar regions with surprising detail. Some show Greenland split into two land masses, a fact confirmed only in recent decades by modern geology. Others portray river systems in Antarctica that could only exist in a pre-glacial environment. These are not fantasy maps. They are navigational tools, annotated, labeled, measured, and they are wrong, only if the timeline is right. But if the timeline is wrong, if knowledge once existed that we are told was not discovered until centuries later, then the maps are not impossible. They are evidence that someone, sometime, possessed a level of geographic awareness far beyond what medieval Europe should have known. So how does this connect to the Dark Ages? It raises an unsettling possibility that the knowledge once housed in ancient centers, Alexandria, Antioch, Pergamon, may not have been destroyed, but sealed away. That remnants of a global awareness, geographical, astronomical, philosophical, survived the purges. Not in the hands of the public, but in hidden collections. Collections curated, controlled, passed quietly through generations of scribes, clerics, and elites. Is it possible that these maps represent fragments of a forgotten era, one carefully erased from the visible timeline? Could this be why the Vatican, for centuries, maintained its own library? A secret archive, sealed to nearly all outsiders, known to house forbidden texts, heretical gospels, and perhaps forbidden maps? Could the knowledge of Earth's true shape, its polar geometry, its continents and currents, have been known, then hidden, then slowly reintroduced at a pace deemed acceptable? If so, then the age of exploration may not have been a discovery, but a release. A carefully timed unveiling of what had once been suppressed. And Piri Reis, perhaps unknowingly, copied not a relic of antiquity, but a trace of a timeline we were not meant to remember. A timeline that predates the Church's control, predates the fall of Rome, predates even the concept of Europe as we know it. A world erased, and now glimpsed only in fragments. A line of ink, a shoreline too precise, a map too detailed, too early, too inconvenient. Civilizations do not forget how to build. Knowledge can be lost in war, libraries can be burned, languages can fade, but tools, real, physical, usable tools, are rarely lost all at once, unless someone decides they should be. At the height of its power, the Roman Empire possessed a remarkable array of technologies: heated floors, indoor plumbing, waterproof concrete, road systems that spanned continents, surgical instruments still recognizable today, aqueducts, cranes, presses, even rudimentary gears. It was not modern, but it was functional. A society capable of mass engineering, resource management, logistics, and sanitation. And then, it stopped. After the empire's fall in the 5th century, much of that infrastructure collapsed. This much is accepted, but what's harder to explain is why it was never rebuilt. Not for a decade, not for a century, but for nearly 1,000 years. Europe reverts to wooden huts. Fields flood for lack of drainage. Streets turn to mud. Plumbing disappears. Masonry regresses. Hospitals vanish. Even writing becomes rare, limited to monasteries and elite clergy. It is as if the continent had forgotten how to think mechanically. But how does an entire society lose the concept of a road? How do people walk past the ruins of Roman aqueducts for generations and never once rebuild them? How does the secret of concrete, a substance that hardens underwater, vanish so completely that it would not be rediscovered until the modern era? This is not the decay of stone. It is the erasure of technique. And it raises an uncomfortable question. Was this forgetfulness natural, or was it orchestrated? Let us consider the timeline. The Roman world fell in the 5th century. But even into the 6th and 7th centuries, Roman engineers were still alive. Roman roads still usable. Baths still functioning. Documents still stored. The transition was not instant. And yet, instead of slow adaptation, what followed was cultural amnesia. By the 9th century, stone construction had nearly disappeared. Europeans struggled to build arches, simple domes, multi-level structures. Public sanitation was gone. Toilets became communal pits. Disease flourished. The Romans had operated a vast network of public toilets, complete with flushing systems. And suddenly, those systems not only vanished, they were treated as dangerous, unholy, unsanitary. Why? Who redefined progress as pagan? Some scholars point to the Church's rising influence, to its emphasis on spiritual purity over material comfort, to a worldview that saw worldly knowledge as a potential threat to divine order. Roman bathhouses were denounced as immoral, medical texts viewed with suspicion, architectural innovations tied to paganism, or worse, heresy. Was it coincidence that so many technologies disappeared just as the Church's grip on knowledge tightened? Or was it policy? If aqueducts are seen as Roman, and Rome is seen as pagan, then rebuilding such systems may be viewed not as practical, but blasphemous. And if knowledge becomes suspect, then ignorance becomes virtue. But even this cultural explanation may not go far enough, because cultural forgetting happens slowly, unevenly. But the decline of Roman technology was strangely uniform. Across Britain, Gaul, Hispania, North Africa, regions that once held imperial infrastructure, the same pattern unfolds. Ruins untouched, techniques unreplicated, tools unreplaced. It is as though something actively discouraged their return. What if the forgetting was not organic? What if it was enforced? The only surviving centers of literacy were monasteries. The only surviving custodians of written knowledge, clergy. And the only texts they chose to preserve were those that aligned with theology. So what happens when a society's only librarians believe that technology threatens salvation? What happens when medicine is called sorcery? When engineering is viewed as pride? When curiosity is seen as rebellion? You get a world where innovation sleeps, not by accident, but by design. And into that vacuum steps the Church, not just as a spiritual guide, but as the new architect of civilization. An architect who decides what gets built, what gets buried, and what gets remembered. In this context, Roman technology doesn't just disappear. It is sidelined, reframed as a relic of a sinful, decadent past. This helps explain why, when the Renaissance finally arrives, so many new discoveries are actually rediscoveries. Concrete, hydraulic systems, perspective drawing, surgical techniques. They had existed, they had functioned, they had thrived, and then they had vanished. The truth is this: technologies rarely vanish because they are impractical. They vanish because they are unwanted. And when a structure as powerful as the medieval church rises, a structure that equates control with order, order with purity, and purity with ignorance, then forgetting becomes sacred, and rebuilding becomes heresy. If a truth is too dangerous to destroy, it must be hidden. And nowhere on earth is more closely associated with hidden truth than a place known, almost mythically, as the Vatican secret archives. Not a legend, not a metaphor, a real physical location. Thousands of shelves, dozens of underground vaults, over 50 miles of documents, unseen by the public, untouched by historians, unread by the world. But what exactly is being protected? Officially, the archive is called the Archivum Secretum Apostolicum Vaticanum. In Latin, secretum does not mean secret in the modern sense. It means private or personal, a technicality. But the result is the same. Access is tightly controlled. Only vetted scholars may enter. Only under supervision. Only a tiny fraction of documents have ever been declassified. Most of the archive remains sealed, permanently. And that raises a question far larger than vocabulary. If the Church is the guardian of divine truth, why does it need to hide its own history? The archive was formally established in the 17th century under Pope Paul V, but it contains documents dating back over 200 years. Letters from emperors, edicts from popes, trial records, scientific treatises, unpublished gospels. Some estimates place the total number of documents at over 35,000 volumes. Others say more, and while the Vatican insists this is simply the result of centuries of careful record-keeping, some historians suspect something else. That the archive functions not only as a repository, but as a vault, a place where inconvenient knowledge is contained rather than preserved. What might be inside? Documents that contradict the Church's own timeline. Proof of early Gospels that undermine canonical scripture. Astronomical records inconsistent with accepted chronology. Accounts of heretical thinkers, suppressed but not destroyed. Correspondence revealing coordinated manipulation of doctrine, dates, or political power. In other words, evidence. Evidence that might support what the phantom time hypothesis suggests. Evidence that entire centuries were adjusted, fabricated, or erased. Of course, the Vatican denies such accusations. It insists the archive's purpose is preservation, that it houses fragile manuscripts unsuited for public display. That secrecy is a matter of respect, not censorship. But history tells another story. In 1810, Napoleon Bonaparte ordered the contents of the Vatican archive to be transferred to Paris. Over 3,000 chests of documents were removed. Among them were materials never before seen: maps, letters, papal decrees, forbidden theological writings. When the documents were returned after Napoleon's fall, many were missing. No official explanation was given, and no inventory was ever released. Even today, scholars can request access, but only to documents dated before 1939. Why 1939? Because that year marks the beginning of Pope Pius XII's reign, a figure mired in controversy for his role during World War II. Requests to study his correspondence or any internal church communications from that period are routinely denied. What else lies behind the cutoff? What remains locked beyond the shelves? There are rumors, never confirmed, of a complete catalogue of banned texts and gospels, many lost elsewhere. Documents detailing church involvement in temporal power structures, including falsified lineages and titles. Letters from astronomers whose work conflicted with church teaching, later silenced. Ancient maps, older than any public collection, detailing pre-Columbian exploration. Trial transcripts of individuals condemned not for heresy, but for possessing forbidden knowledge. In essence, the archive becomes a black hole in the historical record. Not a void of ignorance, but a deliberate suppression. And this is what makes the archive so vital to the theory. If time was manipulated, if centuries were fabricated, if history was rewritten, then the proof, or the blueprints, would likely be kept here, not burned, not deleted, but buried in access, available only to a select few, controlled, managed, contained. And perhaps that is the most effective kind of censorship. Not destruction, but silence. To let the truth exist, but only where no one can see it. To preserve it, so that no one can claim it was erased. But to surround it with ritual, protocol, restriction, to keep it just out of reach. This creates a system of plausible deniability. Nothing is forbidden, they say. It is simply unavailable. But in an age where information defines belief, unavailability is control. And in this control, the archive becomes not a relic of the past, but a tool for shaping the future. Because what is history, if no one can verify it? What is truth, if it lives behind locked doors? And what does it mean? That one institution on Earth claims not only to speak for God, but also to guard his documents? Some warnings are whispered. Others are carved into history. The trial of Galileo Galilei, held in 1633, has become a symbol of the clash between science and faith. A battle of truth versus dogma, of reason versus repression. But was it merely a disagreement about planets, or something far deeper? Galileo was not the first to suggest that Earth orbited the Sun. That idea, heliocentrism, had existed since ancient Greece. In fact, Copernicus had already published his heliocentric model nearly a century earlier. So why was Galileo singled out? What made him dangerous? To answer that, we must first understand the timing. The 17th century was a moment of increasing tension. The Protestant Reformation had shattered religious unity. The Catholic Church was fighting to retain not just spiritual control, but intellectual authority. In such a climate, truth was not just about evidence, it was about obedience. Galileo, armed with his telescope, began to observe what others had only theorized. He saw moons orbiting Jupiter, a miniature solar system, disproving Earth's uniqueness. He noted phases of Venus, visible only if Venus orbited the Sun. He mapped sunspots, contradicting the idea of celestial perfection. He didn't just theorize, he proved. And then he made a critical error. He wrote. In 1632, Galileo published Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, a work comparing the Ptolemaic, Earth-centered, and Copernican, Sun-centered models. But he did more than explain science. He ridiculed the Earth-centered view, placing its arguments in the mouth of a character named Simplicio. To the Church, it was more than mockery. It was defiance. Galileo had already been warned once, years earlier, by the Inquisition. He had promised not to publicly defend heliocentrism. The dialogue broke that promise, indirectly perhaps, but undeniably. And so, the trial began. Galileo was summoned to Rome. He was interrogated. He was threatened. The charge was not scientific error. It was heresy. The Inquisition did not question the moons of Jupiter. They questioned the implication of Galileo's findings, that Scripture might be wrong, that church doctrine might be fallible, that the universe was not a tidy, human-centered system, but something much larger, colder, and indifferent. And that was unacceptable. On June 22nd, 1633, Galileo stood before the tribunal and was forced to recant. He denied the motion of the earth. He swore obedience. He accepted his sentence, house arrest for life. He was 69 years old. His books were banned. His work was forbidden. His name became a cautionary tale. And yet the Church never fully erased him. It did not burn him. It did not silence him entirely. Why? Because the point was not to destroy. The point was to warn. Galileo's trial was not the suppression of one man. It was a public ritual, a message inscribed in fear. This is what happens when observation challenges authority. But consider this. If the Church was willing to prosecute a world-renowned scientist, one with powerful allies, wealth, and fame, what did it do to those with none of those things? How many discoveries, voices, and visions were silenced before they were ever heard? How many manuscripts, hypotheses, or experiments were stopped before they began, because of the shadow cast by Galileo's fate? And what happens to civilization when fear becomes a filter, when knowledge is pursued only up to the point that it offends doctrine? The trial of Galileo is often told as a historical footnote, an embarrassing moment, a mistake later corrected. But what if it was not a mistake at all? What if it was a deliberate, strategic checkpoint, a visible line that no scholar dared cross? What if Galileo's house arrest was not an overreaction, but a calculation? The Church could not unsee the stars, but it could control who got to speak about them. And so Galileo became something more than a scientist. He became a boundary, not just for his time, but for centuries. His fate echoes in the silence of forgotten thinkers, in the lost texts, in the erased diagrams, in the footnotes that never made it into history books. He reminds us that truth can be proven, and still forbidden, and that the real battle is never between science and religion, but between knowledge and power. Because when knowledge threatens power, it must be chained, and the louder the evidence, the tighter the chain. Some thinkers are silenced, others are made into examples. Giordano Bruno was not an astronomer in the traditional sense. He was not a physicist, nor a mathematician, nor an engineer. He was a philosopher, a mystic, a poet of the cosmos. And yet he would meet a fate far more brutal than Galileo's. Because where Galileo offered evidence, Bruno offered possibility. And possibility, when it threatens the foundation of power, is more dangerous than fact. Born in 1548, Bruno entered a Dominican monastery as a young man. He was trained in theology. He studied scripture. But soon he began to ask questions, not just about planets, not just about stars, but about infinity. Bruno proposed a vision of the universe that was radical even by today's standards. He believed the cosmos had no center, that the stars were suns, each with their own worlds, that the universe was infinite, that life existed beyond Earth, and perhaps most dangerously of all, that the divine could not be contained by any single religion. To Bruno, God was not confined to one book, one church, one doctrine. God was everywhere, in everything, a living mind that pulsed through infinite realities. It was a beautiful idea, and a fatal one. Because in proclaiming the universe infinite, Bruno also proclaimed the Church's authority finite. In suggesting other worlds, he diminished the specialness of Earth. In proposing life beyond humanity, he challenged the idea of exclusive salvation. And in questioning Scripture, he undermined centuries of carefully guarded control. Bruno traveled widely. He taught in France, England, and Germany. He debated publicly, provoked academics, wrote relentlessly. His words were not timid. He called theologians ignorant. He accused religious leaders of peddling illusion. He called for a spiritual revolution, one based not on fear, but on cosmic unity. By the time he returned to Italy in 1591, his fate was nearly sealed. He was arrested by the Roman Inquisition, charged with heresy, but his trial was not swift. It lasted 7 years. Why so long? Because the Church did not want to execute a philosopher. It wanted to break him. He was interrogated repeatedly, pressed to recant, urged to admit error. He refused. He would not deny the stars. He would not renounce infinity. He would not confine God to walls built by men. In 1600, the verdict came. Guilty of heresy. His tongue was bound, so he could not speak defiance. He was paraded through the streets of Rome. He was burned alive in the Campo de' Fiori. Witnesses say he died in silence. But his silence was louder than any scream. And the question must be asked, what kind of idea is so dangerous? That it must be killed. Bruno did not lead armies. He did not incite revolution. He did not call for violence. He dreamed of stars. He imagined endless worlds. He dared to believe that truth might exist outside authority. For that, he was destroyed. But his death was not an anomaly. It was the logical conclusion of a system that feared unfiltered thought. Where Galileo was a warning, Bruno was a line in the sand. He proved that the Church's suppression was not only about science, but about cosmic hierarchy, a universe with other worlds, other civilizations, other truths, would make the Church one voice among many, and that it could not allow. So it did what it had done for centuries. It silenced, it erased, it burned. And today, Bruno's name is often mentioned briefly. A footnote, a statue in a Roman square. But what if his vision was more than poetic? What if it was accurate? What if the true danger of Giordano Bruno was not that he was wrong, but that he was right too soon? Because to accept Bruno's universe is to accept that Earth is not the center. That power structures built on cosmic uniqueness may be built on sand. That spiritual truth might not be confined to any single institution, no matter how ancient, how powerful, or how sacred it claims to be. His execution raises a final terrible question. If the Church was willing to burn a man alive, not for what he did, but for what he thought, what else was it willing to do? What else was silenced? What else was erased? What else lies in ashes we no longer see? The story of Bruno is not just about martyrdom. It is about limits, who sets them, why they are enforced, and what it costs to defy them. And in his death, the message is clear. The stars may be infinite, but your thoughts must not be. When dots appear on a page, they seem random, unrelated, innocent. But once the lines are drawn between them, the shape that emerges can no longer be denied. By now, the pattern is clear. The destruction of libraries, the control of language, the manipulation of time, the filtering of scripture, the silencing of thinkers, the sealing of archives. Different events, different centuries, different justifications, but always the same result: control of knowledge. Which leads to a simple, terrifying question. If knowledge has been controlled for over 1,000 years, then who has shaped the version of history we believe? And more importantly, why? The answer begins not with mystery, but with structure. The medieval world was a theocratic pyramid. At the top, God. Below him, the church. Below the church, kings, lords, peasants. But what if that pyramid wasn't just symbolic? What if it was strategic? What if, in order to maintain absolute control over a chaotic, divided continent, the church had to become more than a spiritual authority? It had to become a historical authority, a gatekeeper of time. Because in controlling history, one controls identity. In controlling identity, one controls belief, and in controlling belief, one controls everything. The burning of ancient texts ensured that only one narrative survived. The monopolization of written language ensured that only one class could read that narrative. The rewriting of chronology ensured that rival systems, rival calendars, rival claims were erased, compressed, or pushed beyond recognition. Then came the suppression of thinkers, Galileo, Bruno, and countless others, to ensure that deviations from the official model were punished before they could spread. And finally, the Vatican archives, a vault not for preservation, but for containment. Together, these actions form not a series of accidents, but a system of managed memory. Imagine what it means if this system worked. Imagine if, for over a millennium, the world's most powerful institution curated history like a librarian curates a collection, removing volumes that challenged the central theme, adding ones that reinforced it, rebinding others with new covers and cleaner titles. This, then, is not just a cover-up of individual events. It is the manufacture of reality. And the purpose? Not chaos, not destruction, but something colder, more efficient. Stability. In a fractured medieval world, plagued by wars, famine, rival kings, and competing gods, there was one unifying force that could promise order: the church. But order demands submission, and submission demands certainty. So a world was created in which history began and ended with divine plan. Knowledge flowed only through approved channels. The calendar itself was tailored to reflect not astronomy, but theology. Dissent was not wrong, it was sin. Inquiry was not brave, it was dangerous. And so, generation by generation, an entire civilization was raised to trust not what they could observe, but what they were told. Not to remember, but to inherit memory. This is why the phantom time hypothesis is so threatening, not just because it questions the calendar, but because it questions who has the right to define truth. If 300 years can be invented, if Charlemagne can be fictional, If lineages, papacies, and empires can be restructured retroactively, then what part of history is immune? What part of identity is safe? And what part of modern belief, be it religious, scientific, or national, rests on a foundation that might not exist at all? Because the real cost of this cover-up is not time lost, but trust. Trust in the idea that history is objective, that progress is linear, that knowledge is accumulated, not filtered. But if knowledge is filtered, if history is curated, then our understanding of the present becomes a product of that same curation. And the past, no longer a place of discovery, becomes a stage set, built, lit, and scripted by unseen hands. So the true purpose of the cover-up may not have been deception for deception's sake, but the creation of a world where one story ruled over all others, a story that made questioning dangerous, that made obedience virtuous, that made alternatives invisible. And the greatest success of that story, not that it was believed, but that it was never even questioned. The Renaissance is often painted as a miracle, a sudden blaze of genius bursting forth after centuries of slumber, as if one day the world was cloaked in ignorance, and the next it awoke to Michelangelo's chisel, Leonardo's notebooks, and Copernicus's stars. But what if this rebirth was not spontaneous? What if it was permitted? Because what returns must first have been hidden. Let us consider the timing. The so-called Dark Ages stretched from the 5th to the 15th century. 1,000 years in which literacy declined, cities crumbled, and scientific advancement slowed to a crawl. Then, without warning, Europe began to rediscover the ancient world. Greek philosophy, Roman engineering, mathematical systems, architectural blueprints, medical texts, ideas that had seemingly vanished were suddenly everywhere. They poured into Florence, Venice, Paris, and London. Paintings became lifelike. Books multiplied. The stars were recharted. The human body was mapped. It was as if a vault had opened. But the question lingers: who had the key? Modern textbooks describe the Renaissance as a rediscovery, a period in which Europeans found the knowledge of antiquity. But where exactly had this knowledge been all that time? How does a civilization lose the formula for concrete, then remember it 1,000 years later? How does it forget the mathematics of Archimedes, then suddenly apply it again with precision? How are entire medical systems, maps, and machines lost across continents, then reborn in clusters with uncanny similarity? These are not the fruits of coincidence. They are the marks of controlled access, and that access, it seems, was granted slowly, strategically, and never entirely. One source, often overlooked, offers a clue. The monastic libraries. Throughout the Middle Ages, monasteries were among the only places where manuscripts were copied and stored. Run by monks, supervised by church authority, guarded from the public. And in those quiet scriptoria, over centuries, the works of Plato, Galen, Ptolemy, Euclid, and others were not lost. They were held until a time when releasing them could serve a purpose. Because sudden knowledge creates revolution, but slow knowledge creates loyalty. By releasing ancient truths gradually, through sanctioned universities, approved scholars, and church-sponsored patrons, the guardians of history could rewrite the script of awakening itself. The Renaissance, then, was not a break from the Church's control. It was a rebranding, from oppressor to benefactor, from censor to curator, from withholder to rediscoverer. but the flow of knowledge was never free. Giordano Bruno, burned. Galileo, silenced. Dozens of others, erased. Only those whose works aligned with orthodoxy were elevated. Others remained buried beneath centuries of dust. Or ashes. And what of the artists? Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Raphael. All worked under commissions. Their patrons? The Medici, the popes, the crowned heads of Europe. Those who held both spiritual and temporal power. Their works were brilliant, but also symbolic. The human body, once shamed, became divine. The individual, once suppressed, became heroic. The world, once flat and fixed, became round and in motion. But these revelations were not just aesthetic. They were ideological. They reframed old truths in a new light, but only those truths deemed safe. The Renaissance was not a full liberation. It was a filter, a careful selection of what would be allowed back into the world, and what would remain in silence, and so knowledge returned. But not all at once, not evenly, and not without a price. Consider this. If ancient texts could be found in the 1400s, why not in the 1200s? Why not in the 1100s? Were they undiscovered? Or undisclosed? And if the Church was the gatekeeper for centuries, why did it suddenly become the midwife of rebirth? Could it be that the Renaissance was a pressure valve? A way to release just enough knowledge to satisfy curiosity, while maintaining control over the larger narrative? Because when people believe they are free to explore, but are only exploring within boundaries laid long ago, control becomes invisible. And invisible control is the most powerful kind. The Renaissance, then, was not a revolution. It was a negotiation between the thirst for truth and the fear of what truth might do. A truce, signed in ink and gold leaf, between curiosity and authority. And though the vaults opened, the keys were never handed over. A lie does not need to shout. It only needs to be repeated, quietly, consistently, from a trusted source. And what source is more trusted than a school book? Today, children across the world open their textbooks and read about the Dark Ages. They see a timeline, a fall of Rome, a 1,000-year decline, then, suddenly, a Renaissance. This is the version of history taught in classrooms, broadcast in documentaries, accepted in universities. It is presented not as theory, but as fact. And like all effective narratives, it begins early, before questions can be asked. From primary school to postgrad, the structure remains. Timelines are linear. Civilizations rise and fall. The Church is holy. The ancients were backward. The Renaissance was a rebirth. But what if that entire arc, from darkness to light, was crafted? What if the facts taught to billions were selected not for truth, but for utility? Utility to whom? To the same institutions that shaped the timeline in the first place. Because education, for all its virtues, is also a system of inheritance. It does not begin with blank pages. It begins with canon. And that canon, often unknowingly, passes on centuries of curated memory. The stories of burned libraries become footnotes. The manipulation of time is dismissed as pseudoscience. The Vatican archives are rarely mentioned. And when they are framed as sacred mystery, not suppression. The phantom time hypothesis? Laughed off. Not addressed, not debated. simply ignored. In this way, silence becomes agreement, and absence becomes validation. Modern education rarely tells students what to think. It simply tells them what exists. And by defining the perimeter of what is real, it makes everything else disappear. But the ghost of the cover-up lives on. In every history exam that lists the Dark Ages as a time of ignorance, in every essay that celebrates Charlemagne as a founding father, in every classroom globe calibrated to a Gregorian timeline, even the calendar on your phone, its weeks, its years, its holidays, is part of the structure. We still live in the chronology shaped by the Church. We still name our centuries based on a birth dated by the same institution that guarded the archives. We still align our time, unknowingly, to a clock that may have skipped forward without consent. And then there is the media, the documentaries, the educational YouTube videos, the articles that begin with "historians agree." They are not malicious. Most are sincere. But sincerity does not equal truth. And repetition does not equal proof. Much of what passes as historical consensus is built upon layers of assumed accuracy. One generation citing the last, a pyramid of trust, rarely re-examined from the base. This is how the lie persists, not because of censorship, but because of inertia. Once a story is installed, once it is funded, printed, credentialed, it becomes self-sustaining. To challenge it is not just to challenge facts, but to challenge entire careers, institutions, worldviews. And so it stays, not because it is unbreakable, but because it is untouchable. Meanwhile, the consequences grow, because if our understanding of the past is flawed, then so too is our map of the present. If the Renaissance was staged, if centuries were fabricated, if power erased what it feared, then what else do we believe that was designed for belief? What other systems, educational, political, spiritual, rest on foundations that were adjusted, edited, or entirely constructed? What if our modern debates, our scientific models, even our ethical assumptions, are echoes of an ancient fiction? And if that is the case, how does one begin to see the truth? The answer is not destruction, not cynicism, not rejection of knowledge. It is something subtler and harder. It is the willingness to wonder, to look at the page and ask, not what's printed, but what's missing. To look at the pattern and ask, not if it's elegant, but who drew it. To see education not as a conclusion, but as a question left open, because until the vaults are opened, until the archives are shared, until the gaps are acknowledged, the legacy of the lie will remain intact, not in secrets whispered in shadow, but in lessons taught beneath fluorescent lights by those who never knew they were repeating a script. History is not written in stone. It is written in ink. And ink, as every scribe knows, can be scraped away. What we call the past is not a solid thing. It is a story told, retold, translated, edited, and approved. And yet, it shapes everything. It shapes the flags we raise, the names we honor, the borders we defend, the truths we teach our children. But what if the story was altered? What if the editors of history had motives? Timelines to manipulate, empires to preserve, not through fiction, but through selection. To tell a story is to decide what to include and what to leave out. So consider, what if the most dangerous lies in history were not the ones told, but the ones untold. 1,000 years of darkness. Destroyed libraries, silenced voices, fabricated years, erased names, altered scriptures, guarded archives. Each detail, on its own, might be explainable, but taken together, they whisper a different possibility, that the Dark Ages may not have been a void of knowledge, but a veil, that what lay behind it was not ignorance, but intervention, and that the world we live in today, its rhythms, its calendars, its assumptions, was built upon that intervention. Some will say, it does not matter, that the past is past, that myths and facts are natural companions, but the past is never truly past. It lives in the clock. It lives in the classroom. It lives in the names etched in stone. And most of all, it lives in the mind, because to control the past is to shape the present, and to limit the present is to design the future. So what now? What does one do when the ground beneath belief begins to shift? There is no call here to revolt, no demand to tear down institutions, no claim of secret knowledge or hidden keys. There is only a whisper, a suggestion, a doubt. What if we looked again? What if we questioned the gaps, listened for the silences, revisited the stories we were told, and asked who told them, and why? This is not skepticism for its own sake. It is the beginning of something else, a restored curiosity, a hunger not for conspiracy, but for clarity, not for answers, but for better questions. Because maybe history is not a fixed line. Maybe it is a tapestry, one with missing threads, faded dyes, and stitched-over truths. And maybe the task of the present generation is not to blindly preserve what was passed down, but to look at it honestly, hold it up to the light, and ask, is this all there ever was, or is there more? Beneath the ink,